Welcome to another episode of the Heritage Buildings podcast. I'm Vincent Reed, your host. Today, we are honoured to be joined by Philip Gaches, a master plasterer and one of the most respected figures in traditional plasterwork and conservation. Philip has led Gaches Traditional Plasterers since 1987, continuing a family legacy started by his father, Gordon Gaches, in 1948. Under his leadership, the company has worked on some of the UK's most iconic buildings, including Royal Palaces, Downing Street, Houses of Parliament, Grimsthorpe Castle and Ickham Place. Philip's expertise has also taken him worldwide, from Myanmar to Afghanistan to Transylvania, where he taught and lectured on conserving traditional plasterwork. He has published several articles and books, including early British plasterwork and his forthcoming title, Lime Plastering and Decorative Arts. So welcome to the podcast, Philip.
Thank you very much, Vincent. I'm very pleased to be here.
I'm very excited because I looked at some of your projects on your website, and I'm going to ask you some questions. And it's one craftsperson to another, a different trade, but there are similarities. And so I'm going to be really interested in understanding how you do what you do. So, but first of all, could we just start with your background and just tell us a bit about your apprenticeship and how you became involved in the family business?
Yeah, sure. Well, it certainly wasn't planned. My father was a plasterer, as you already mentioned. So I did some casual work with him during school holidays when I was at school. And then my leaving school was completely chaotic. We had no plan for what I was going to do. We didn't really talk about my vision of my future. I don't think I really had one, like probably a lot of people when they're 16. Don't want to think too much about being an adult and grown up and all the worries that come with that. So I left school one afternoon without any idea of what I was going to do the following day. I went home and we sat and had dinner, family dinner, and I said, "Oh, by the way, I've left school today." My father said, "Oh, what will you do?" And I said, "I'm going to have a couple of weeks off holiday and then I'm going to start applying for jobs." And he said, "I tell you what, you can start with me tomorrow and you can be thinking about what you want to do with your career whilst you're working with me." He was a very cunning man. What of course he knew was that if I had a couple of weeks off, it would turn into a couple of months and then 6 months, and then I'd end up doing, nothing for ages. Work was so hard, physically hard, that I didn't really have the strength to think about anything else. At that time, my father was working with my uncle and my brother and my brother-in-law. And so I joined the team and made us 5. They worked me almost to death in that first year, or certainly felt like it. But of course, I was a schoolboy, So they worked me really hard. I was exhausted. But I must have grown some muscles, got a bit stronger, And after 6 months of that, I decided that actually I quite liked it. But I was doing most of the labouring in those days. And that wasn't what I wanted to do. I could see that my father was creating beautiful plasterwork, and that was what I wanted to do. But I also knew that they didn't have time to teach me at that time. They were teaching me various things, but not as quickly. I was a young person. I wanted to go quick. I wanted to be a plasterer the following day. So I looked into apprenticeships and found one at Norwich City College under the tutorship of a wonderful plasterer and a lovely man called John Ford. And I announced that I was going to enroll on that. My father didn't want me to, because that meant me being away from home and away from site. But nevertheless, he supported me. I enrolled for that apprenticeship, which was a 3-year apprenticeship in plain and decorative plasterwork. And at the end of which I thought I knew everything, but still knew pretty much nothing. But I came back to site, and by which time my uncle had left and retired, my brother had moved on, and my brother-in-law had moved on himself. And so there was just me and my father, and we took on an assistant, and he and I then became the plasterers with the assistant looking after us. And I think it was only after working for another few years, maybe 3 or 4 more years, that I realized when I left college, I still knew almost nothing, but I had the bones of a sort of an understanding of most of the processes. And during the next few years, my father taught me just most of the things I needed to know to then take over. As you mentioned, he died very suddenly and without warning in 1987. And so at the grand old age of 23, I took over the business, still mere boy, really. You know, at 23, you think you're really grown up, don't you? But
Yeah.
still a child, really. So how we survived, I don't know, but we seem to have done something right.
Yeah, absolutely. And what's your sort of typical day when you first started in your father's business? You left school, and what was your typical day? You know, laboring. What were you doing?
Yeah. So we were up at 7, out the door at 7:30. Mother prepared breakfast. We'd walk downstairs, breakfast on the table. We'd eat and straight out the door. We worked locally in those days. We didn't tend to travel very far. So by 8 o'clock at the latest, we would be on site. And my role was preparing all of the tools, preparing all of the mortar, depending on the project we were doing, making sure that my father had everything he needed just to walk in the room and go. And God help me if I didn't, if he walked in the room and I'd got something wrong. He was pretty short-tempered with me, but I must have driven him mad, I'm sure, at that time. And then as soon as he was working, my next job would be to prepare somewhere for us to have lunch, because of course in those days there was no welfare provision on site. There was often no electricity, no toilets. So all of that kind of had to be catered for. And that was my role too. If it was winter, I'd have to light a fire in the grate to keep the house warm wherever we were working, and give my father somewhere to toast his sandwiches on when he had his morning break. And just generally making sure everything was clean. So as soon as he'd finished, he'd sit down for his sandwiches. I had to make sure everything was clean and ready for as soon as he'd finished his tea to get started again. Sounds a bit like slavery, doesn't it? Modern day slavery.
It's funny because it's almost sort of a Victorian way of working. You know, you worked with your father, and your father had to be quite a disciplinarian because you had to learn quickly, and time was money. So what's interesting is I know that you have, I think it's your sons that are in the business now. What I find interesting is how many young boys now would go to work with their father, do what you did, be shouted at a few times and make sure you had to get everything ready for him. And how many now would stick at it, and
Mhm.
and how many would just leave and go off and work in Tesco stacking shelves because it's easier.
Certainly, well, probably easier, yes. I mean, yeah, I'm not as strict as my father. I think if we compare his upbringing to mine, they are chalk and cheese. You know, he joined the army when he was 15 to go and fight in the Second World War. And at that point, he was one of 13 children. So at that point, he was ready to go to France. His commanding officer discovered that he was only 15, and he was honorably discharged and sent home. And then, as soon as he was 17, he joined the Air Force. Never actually went to war, thankfully. He was then based in England. Of course, my upbringing was very soft in comparison with that. We weren't at
Yeah.
war. Things were stable. When I was born, it was only 18 years after the war had finished. So, to a degree, the country was still recovering economically and socially. There were still lots of sort of bomb damaged sites that hadn't been rebuilt when I was a kid. So, food was scarce, but we always ate reasonably well, simply. But mum's role was to go shopping every day and prepare food for the family and make sure everything was clean at home. That was her role. And, that's just the way things were. And now, of course, we're all supposed to go out to work, aren't we? And rightly so,
Yeah.
if that's what people choose to do.
Yeah.
So my upbringing was very different to his. He lived I think when him and my mum first married, they lived in a terrace of houses where nobody had running water in the house. And he was the
Mm.
first one to install a lead pipe and a cold tap into the house. And then everybody
Oh,
down the street paid him to come and do this. Of course, when I was born, we had a bungalow that he'd built himself and all of the modern conveniences that the early 60s had to offer. Of course, when my children were born, they were born in 98 and 2001. It's a whole different world, isn't it? You
yeah,
know, the access to everything is completely different. They've grown up with the internet, and we're a wealthier society.
yeah,
So we can give them more. And so inevitably they've grown up differently to how we did. And in some respects, that's good, that they're safer and they've plenty of food. And I think actually a good marker of the food situation is that they're both 6 feet tall. Uh, and uh, and nearly everybody I went to school with reached about sort of 5'8".
yeah,
Uh, nobody was tall. They have access to better healthcare, better food, and the internet. So it's a whole different world.
yeah. But even in my day when I was an apprentice, it was so much harder than it is today. For instance, I worked in this cabinet making shop in Portslade near Brighton,
Mhm.
and there were some real ruffians working there, and you used to, it wasn't easy. In a joking way, you'd get knocked about a little bit, and one of their sort of apprentice tricks was calling you over to say they wanted to explain, how they're going to do something. So they'd call you over, and when
Mm.
you came over, they would pinch your chest. That was just the thing. It was just one of the sort of games that they had with the apprentices. So this went on, and one day I was at home, and I was only about 17 or something, and I remember taking my top off, and my mother said, "What on earth is that?" And I had the colors of the rainbow all
Yeah.
around my chest with
Wow.
bruising. And I said, "Oh, it's just where the lads are mucking around." And rather than her, pulling me out or calling social services or the police or whatever, she said to me, "Well, go in there and stick up for yourself."
Yeah.
And
Yes.
I'm not saying that, I'm not advocating that that's the right thing to do now, but how times have changed. And I had to go in there. I remember this chap did it to me again, and I
Mm.
sort of got him in a headlock. And it was that moment where they stopped doing it because I
Yeah, of
stuck
course.
up for myself. But that was in 1985 or 86 only. Now
Yeah.
that never would happen now. And
No.
I'm not saying it should happen, but just the apprentices had to be tougher. And your apprenticeship, you had to clean the tools and be there and work. Like you say, you worked your socks off and got
Mhm.
exhausted. And it just seemed to be the way it was. That's what you did. And it just seems to be a
Yeah,
bit different now, I feel.
it definitely is. And in some respects, they're worse off for it. I wouldn't advocate, as you said, any physical discipline, but we do need to be firm with young people
Yeah.
and they appreciate it. It's complicated when they're your children in a lot of ways because they know they can go home and say to mum, "You won't believe what dad said to us today."
Yeah.
And
Then you've got it in the neck.
exactly, then I'm in trouble. I mean, they have been shouted at plenty of times when they were young,
Yeah.
when he started working with me. I think William was 18 when he started, or nearly 18. He did another apprenticeship with a computer firm first, and then he got laid off and came with me temporarily, and then kind of just got stuck into it. Jude, my youngest son, came with me from 16 straight from school. And I'm sure you remember, it's a bit of a shock, isn't it, where it's all relaxed and sure, people tell you off for not writing an essay on time or stuff like that, but it's just school. They don't take it too seriously, but it's a culture shock when you come to site, and they've both been shouted at plenty of times. The thing now is they're so much bigger and stronger than me that if I shout at them, they knock me about. I have to be very careful.
Yeah.
It's
So,
really nice because I just, sorry, quickly,
no.
I do feel very sort of safe with the boys that we work away from home a lot and sometimes not always in the nicest areas. Often dilapidated historic buildings can be in very difficult areas and they do look after me. I do always feel safe when I'm
No.
working away from boys.
No, it's
That's
lovely.
really, yeah, it is. It
No.
is.
So you were 23 when you took over the family business, and you obviously still had a lot to learn. But what skills as a plaster had you acquired at that time to enable you to, not let the name of the family business down?
It's a tricky one because, as I said, my father died very suddenly without warning. And I was absolutely thrown in at the deep end. I could have thrown in the towel at that point and gone and done something else. But I did say to my father, he was in a coma for a few days, and I did spend some time with him. And I did say to him that he had no need to worry about the business. I would look after it and I would nurture it and grow it, and keep it going. I don't know whether he heard me, but that's something I've never sort of forgotten, that once I'd made that statement, I was kind of committed to that then for the rest of my life, I suppose. And
Yeah.
it's kind of become an obsession. I mean, at that point, when I was 23, I'd been plastering for 7 years. I was a very competent flat plasterer. I had some mold making skills, but really knew very little, had a lot more to learn. So I needed to be taught that by an older plasterer. And as my father had gone, I needed to then find a way to link up with more experienced plasterers and gain better experience. And the only way to really do that is to go and work with people. You need to learn on live projects. If you can go back and you can do little 2-day courses in this or that or the other, but really being on a live project, you have to overcome all of the obstacles that you find where things aren't level, where things aren't straight, where you have to stretch to get into the corner to do something because the scaffold's not right. It's that kind of thing, that kind of education that really qualifies to be able to do the work really well. Whereas when you learn something in a classroom or a workshop for a couple of days, you come away with the knowledge, but you don't have the physical experience of actually doing it. It's the struggle that kind of makes you, I think. So I was a reasonably competent plasterer, but more importantly, I knew nothing about business. Absolutely nothing. I'd never written an invoice. I'd never spoken to a client about prices. My father left a pricing book, which I still have today, with various rates, but I didn't know how up to date that was. We had one job on the books, which I contacted the builders about and said, had to explain what had happened. My father had died, and I said, we're still coming to do the job though. We're gonna finish that. And we did that, and that was okay. And then some builders who we'd worked for before got in touch. They built a new house, a big new house, and they said, do you still want to come and plaster it? No, your father's died. And I said, yes, we'll come and do it. They said, okay, that's great. Give us a price for the walls and the floors, because we'll plasterboard and Artex the ceilings ourselves. And I said, okay, and this is a big sort of 6-bedroom house, triple garage with a snooker room over. It was a big job. So I sent them a quotation, plastering the walls, float and set the walls, and screed the floors. And they said, yes, that's fine. And just as we were getting started, they came back to me on the phone and said they came to my father's funeral. They said, oh, we'd like you to do the ceilings. Is that okay? And I said, yeah, sure. Shall I just do that on our meterage rate? I told them what that was, but this is verbal, And they said, yeah, that will be fine. There was hundreds of meters. And so we did all of that. We did the whole job and finished it. This is my experience, finishing everything without getting any money from them. I supplied all of the materials, and they came back to me and said, what's the item on the invoice for extras? And I said, well, it's the ceilings. You asked me to do the ceilings. And the guy said, on your quotation, it says plastering at 2 Main Street, Gretford. And as far as we're concerned, that covers all of the plastering. And I said, well, we had a conversation on the phone where you agreed to this, that, and the other. And he said, I've no record of that. I don't know anything about that.
Oh.
So, of course, it's the second job after my father's died. I'm 23 years old. I'm completely out of my depth, really. I paid out all of this money for work, and I spoke to a solicitor and he said, there's nothing you can do because all you've said on your quotation is plastering. He said, you're going to have to learn from it and accept
Mm.
it. So they knowingly took me for about probably £2,500 at that time, which I really couldn't afford. Remember, I hadn't
No.
taken over my father's business. I'd had to start a new one because my father's business was closed on his death. So we
Uh,
didn't have any of the assets that came with my father's business. This was just my savings, which was basically zero. So I was living on credit with the builders merchants. So they ripped me off and they knew they did it and they did it intentionally. And I was stupid enough to fall for it. But boy, has that lesson stayed with me. It
yeah.
was the most important lesson I've ever learned in business.
Yeah, I mean,
Um,
shame on them, but those sorts of lessons are meant to be, aren't they? You know, you have to
yeah,
learn the hard way.
it's hugely valuable.
Mm, yeah.
Yeah.
And what, at this stage, was it always traditional plastering, or you had to mix it up a little bit, you know, just to get the work in? It was varied from sort of modern plastering to traditional plastering at this stage.
No, we'd always done a combination of the two.
Yeah.
Because my father never wanted to travel very far, whatever projects we were offered, as long as they were local, he would take. So we were doing, a range of things from historic building conversions to small repairs and ornamental repairs and brand new houses and occasional office blocks in factories.
Mm.
It was whatever came in, really.
Yeah, absolutely. But that must have been incredibly difficult for you to just continue with your loss of your father so suddenly, and then you had to continue working in the same industry.
Yeah.
And then you had to learn how to run a business as well.
Overnight, yes, that's right. And I had to change the way I dressed at the time because I'd turn up, I was a young looking 23-year-old. So I'd turn up to look at a job, and people actually said to me, do you really run the business? Are you old enough? Do you really know what you're doing?
Yeah.
I understand now looking back what they were thinking, but my father had a really good reputation locally. So we did know quite a lot of nice builders and we had some nice clients and work trickled in. But I became increasingly aware that I really enjoyed the traditional work and I found the modern work boring. Prices were low and it was very hard physical work. So about 2 or 3 years in, maybe around about 1989, 1990, I became aware of the SBAB
Mm.
and joined them. Looked at doing the fellowship, but we couldn't afford it because we had a mortgage by then and it's not completely funded. So we'd have had no income coming in. So we didn't do the fellowship, which I kind of regret now, but I know that at the time it was just impossible to fund. So I became more aware of historic buildings and what was going on. And then I think I gradually began to switch the business over from, sort of maybe 60% new work and 40% traditional to 50-50, then 60-40 the other way. And it took about 10 years to completely transform the business from doing a varied types of work to just doing traditional. By the mid 90s, we were just doing traditional work. And that was sort of helped by the fire at Windsor to a degree. We were around about sort of 95. I guess we were doing quite a bit of traditional work, but finding it very difficult to break into the market in any big way. It was at that time, most of the plaster work was being done by conservation companies. So you had firms like St. Blaise, Hurst Conservation, those guys were getting most of the plastering. So I was finding it very difficult to get into the market. And then, quite by chance, I bumped into a woman who's still a friend to this day, Alex, in the street, walking her dog. She was picking up a bag of plaster and she had the same breed of dog as we had at the time. So we stood talking about the dogs. And I said, oh, I looked down and I said, you've got plaster on your boots. Why have you got plaster on your boots? I don't think I'd ever met a woman on a building site at that time. And she said, "Oh, we do a bit of sort of church conservation work at Hurst." And I said, "Oh, right, well, I do lime plastering. If you ever need anybody, maybe make a get in touch." And she said, "Oh, actually, we need somebody next week. We've got a project on in London, in Lee, at a church, and we're struggling to find anybody that can lime plaster." So the next week I was in London. I'd hardly ever left the village at this point, turning up on site, expecting everybody else to be much more experienced than I was, and that they'd gather quite quickly that I was inexperienced and throw me off site, and I'd be on the train home, and that would be it, career over in traditional plaster work. But what I actually found when I got to site was that the little bit that I knew was much more than anyone else there.
Yeah.
Uh, so suddenly I realized there probably was a place for me in the traditional world, and Hearst were very good. I worked with them then as a subcontractor for the next 5 years, and that was a great inroad into the industry. And during that time, of course, made the right contacts, and the rest is history, as they say.
Yeah. Oh, amazing. Now, just for our listeners that are unfamiliar with the trade, can you provide a brief overview of what traditional plaster work is, what it entails?
A brief, how brief? An
Oh,
hour?
yeah,
Um,
exactly. You can
yes,
take as
I'll
long as
try.
you want.
What we try and do as a business is, when we look at a project, depending on the period that the house was built in, or that part of the house was built in, we try to repair the plasterwork using methods, materials, and tools that are authentic to that period. So if that means the house was built in 1580, then we'll use an Elizabethan or a Tudor system in order to repair that plasterwork. And things are very different from period to period. So it's really that in a nutshell. It's trying to repair the original plasterwork like for like, using traditional materials, traditional tools, and technique. And by doing that, we're able to create plasterwork that matches and marries harmoniously with the original material and the original building. So that's from an aesthetic point of view. So the texture of the plaster recreates the texture of the original plaster, but also performance works beautifully with the original building. It will enable the original building to breathe in the same way that it was designed to do. And that may be internally, that plaster will last a long time and will allow the moisture to breathe through it. And that's a very nice natural process. Externally, sometimes the plaster is sacrificial. So it's not supposed to last more than maybe 20 years before it's hacked off and put back on again. It's a different way of looking at the use of materials on buildings.
Mm.
So without becoming too complicated, I think that original statement of plastering a building like for like is traditional plasterwork,
Yeah.
traditional materials and techniques.
Does the composition of the plaster vary from region to region?
Region to region and period to period, yes,
Yeah.
enormously.
When you look at now, you're looking at a lump of plaster that you've got to, replicate and mix. Can you normally understand material used for that particular plaster, or do you ever have to take it off for analysis to then match like for like, or how does that work?
Mostly, but an analysis kind of starts in the hand, doesn't it, with the eye? Just by holding a piece of the plaster, we can pretty much tell you what's in it, what aggregate was used, because of course the early plasters, they weren't really using sand in the way that we do now and the way the Georgians did. Up until about 1700, most sort of plasters or decorative ceilings anyway didn't contain sand. It was more a mixture of stone dust and lime with tons and tons of hair. So you can also, by looking at a piece of plaster, you can determine the age of that plaster or the period, whether it was Elizabethan or Georgian or Victorian. You can tell because there are quite strong differences between the various periods.
God, how
So
interesting. And was it, did they grind the stones then to get the stone dust? Is that how they
so
did it?
we think the stone dust was often a byproduct of the quarry or the masons, where the masons were doing all of their
Ah,
carving and cutting. All of that stone dust was kept and used in the building. Because performance-wise, stone dust is very different to sand in that what the early plasterers were looking for, and you have to remember that early decorative ceilings really grew out of pargeting, the sort of naive decorative finish you see on the outside of cottages and houses in Suffolk and Essex and sometimes Norfolk. When ceilings first started to be plastered, which was only, as far as we know, the earliest one was 1480.
oh, wow.
Um, Before that, there's no use of plaster on ceilings.
Hmm.
There are no ceilings because most of the fires are on the floor in the main chamber.
Yes.
So the smoke has to be allowed to drift up out through the roof, in your medieval Great Hall. It's only around about 1450 when domestic fireplaces become popular and chimneys and flues are installed in the walls.
Hmm.
So what you often find in those medieval buildings is that there's a difference between the building material around the fireplace and the building material to the rest of the building because the fireplace has been inserted often.
I
Uh,
see.
and and then the word sealing itself comes from sealing off the top of the room because no longer do you need to let the smoke drift up through the roof. So you can seal. You can
Oh,
seal.
that's fantastic. I didn't realize that.
Yeah. It's quite a profound thing, isn't it? A word we all use without really thinking about its origin. So it's
Amazing.
closely linked with the sort of popularity of the domestic fireplace and chimneys. So in that respect, the decorative ceilings were coming from pargeting, and they were largely in areas where chalk was the predominant building material. And so there was lots of chalk dust around. So they were using chalk and lime, which gave you on very fragile, sort of flexible timber buildings. They needed a material that would flex and move with the building. Just the thermal expansion and contraction was one thing, but they developed this material was essentially just chalk and lime with lots and lots of animal hair. And I mean tons of animal hair. So the hair actually does two different things. It ties everything together, it knots within the mortar, but it's also so numerous that it stops the mortar from forming a dense matrix. So it acts like 1,000 hinges. So it
Ah,
enables flex and move because it's so numerous. The mortar can't form that really hard, dense matrix that you find on a sand mortar. Now, that's a great quality because that means it can flex hugely without breaking and cracking. But if you then imagine 1700 and people want to create Palladian cornices with everything straight and organized and perfect, that original material doesn't lend itself to that process. So at around about sort of 1680 to 1700, sand becomes more prevalent in mortars because it creates a mortar that will flow like a liquid, and hair is reduced. The amount of hair in the mortars is reduced. So you end up with a harder, tougher, straighter material, but it's lost that sort of ability to flex with a building. When people talk about lime plasters flexing with the building, if it's got sand in it, that's a pretty hard, brittle material, and it won't flex with a building. It's only the very early mortars that have this high quantity of hair in them and low quantity of sand that have that true ability. And we use materials now very similar to those original materials with just chalk and lime and fibers. And we can lay that out in a sheet and let it dry overnight. And the following day, we can roll it up like a parchment. It's that flexible.
oh,
Whereas, of course, with sand mortar, you can't do that.
yeah.
And Simon Swan, the plasterer from Norfolk, once described it as the difference between a digestive biscuit and a Garibaldi biscuit.
That's a good analogy.
Isn't it? Yeah, it's pretty good, that.
And I'm fascinated by I don't know what you call them, the wooden profiles that you make to draw the cornices out. What do you
Mhm.
call them? Are they profiles or
A running mold.
running
Um,
mold? Okay. And what material did they typically use, let's say back in the 1600s and 1700s? Yeah, what type of, was it, beech or something solid?
Well, so there's a huge difference between 1600s and 1700s, because that's where we get that sort of division of design and style. We go
Mm,
from the simple Jacobean post-Civil War naturalistic design of the sort of second half of the 17th century to 1700, where we go into Palladianism. And as I just mentioned, the material is changed. So sand is added, hair is reduced, and gypsum is brought in. And at that point, they start using zinc templates. So the running mold is made in the shape of the cornice profile. And then that's fixed to a rule to the wall, and the mold can be drawn along the rule and create a dead straight cornice profile. But if we go back to sort of pre-1650, that the molds that are being used to make the profiles at that point, remember this is the earlier material, because it has hair in it, so much hair, you can't cut it. So you can't draw a zinc profile through it because it tears and you just end up pulling it all off the wall. So the originals, the sort of Elizabethan Jacobean plasterers, used to use just wooden molds with a wooden profile. And the profile was shaped, angled, so that it became more like a troweling action
yeah.
and a cutting action. So if you imagine you've got a profile cut out of a piece of timber and you chamfer the back of that profile away from that profile. Instead of drawing it with the chamfer on the back, you draw it with the chamfer on the front.
Yeah.
So that excess material gets pushed onto the cornice by the chamfer, and you draw it along, and it becomes more of a troweling action through the chalk and lime. And that, in terms of performance, that material, it feels more like a clay because it's very sticky and it's very kind of gloopy, but it trowels to a very smooth surface. So you're drawing this wooden mold along across the surface, and it's kind of troweling as it goes rather than cutting with the zinc. By the time we're using that, they're mixing plaster of Paris or gypsum with lime putty, and there's no hair in the finish coat. So they can draw it through and form this beautiful, sharp, straight cornice.
Oh,
But
how
if you
interesting.
compare ceilings from the two different periods, you can actually see that, because the original moldings are never that straight. They're always a little bit wobbly,
Yeah.
generally straight, when you look at, and geometrically often very good. But if you look closely, you'll see that there are little wobbles in the face of the moldings. So we know they were holding handheld wooden tools to do that. And we can see by the texture of the surface, we can see the little marks where the wood grain is caught and drawn along on the face of the material. And if you think about, I mean, I'm getting very technical now.
No, I
But if
love
you
this. This is fantastic.
if you think about a Jacobean ceiling where you have quite a wide rip with a decorative soffit, and we found at Apethorpe when we conserved those ceilings back in 2006, that we could still see the texture on that little decorative soffit from where it had been pressed into a wooden mold and then peeled out while still wet and pressed into place with the wooden mold. And then the wooden mold had been pulled off it, leaving it in place. And the texture on the surface was that little raised sort of texture that you'd get if you pulled a piece of plaster off a piece of wood. So we could see exactly how they'd made those little cast elements. And then they were made in about sort of 6 or 7 inch lengths. And we could see little shiny tool marks where they joined. So they were using little bladed tools to just bring the joints together. So the evidence of exactly how that was made was all there for us to see.
Oh, it's fascinating. And did they have a favoured wood for the moulds?
Yeah, sorry, that was the original question, wasn't it?
No, no,
Yeah,
this is amazing.
oak was used because it's a great hardy timber, isn't it?
Yeah.
But but then the molds were being carved out of wood. They were using things like lime, because lime, I think, for carving details is very good. It's a close-grained wood.
That's what I was
Um,
thinking. It would be lime or beech or hornbeam, something like that. There, it's where it's a really close grain, and it would, tend to last a little bit longer because oak is obviously a very strong wood, but it can be vulnerable for cracking or just breaking at the edges because the grain
yeah,
isn't as close as the
yeah.
others. You must have come across these molds, these early molds before.
They're very rare. I mean, early molds. We find quite a lot of molds from the first half of the 18th century. And I think George Jackson's in London have got a great collection of those. I've never seen them, but I have an invite to go, but of course never have the time. But I think they've collected a great mass of these wooden molds. We've got one or two here. But if you go back further into the first half of the 17th century and into the 16th century, they were using wooden molds then. They don't seem to have survived the very early ones.
Mm,
They were often destroyed intentionally at the end of the project on the instructions of the client
of
because
course.
they didn't want them copied.
Yeah.
But the plasterers did copy them because we know that Hall in Norfolk has a lot of the same small details on their ceilings as the ones at Apethorpe Palace. So we know that the
Hmm.
same plasterer did the two projects. Although it's not documented at Apethorpe, all of the documentation there was lost or destroyed. Blickling, they are, and the name escapes me, but it might come back to me. That was still understood.
Yeah,
You can imagine them being the aristocracy at the time being incredibly fussy about having their own bespoke molding.
Hmm.
And, God forbid anybody else would have the same one. It would be really
It's still the
embarrassing.
same. Still the same today.
Yes.
We still sometimes have instructions to destroy everything at the end of the project.
Do you really?
Oh yes, yeah. I mean, especially coats of arms.
yeah.
Yeah.
If they're very personal. We have instructions that we're not allowed to copy them, which of course we never would because we would really don't want them. And then instructions to destroy the mold at the end of the project. But one particular project, we had a coat of arms that was about 6 or 7 feet across that we took a mold of and were instructed to only make one copy and then destroy it, which we did. And then at the end of the project, the client said, "Oh, I want the mold for the coat of arms." And I said, "Well, it went in the skip." And he said, "Oh, I want it to make a copy of it for my other house in France." And I said, "Well, it's gone. You instructed me." And he accused me of lying. And I said, "Well, look, it's gone. I didn't take a picture of it in the skip. Just going to have to trust me. It's gone." So they're still the same, I'm afraid.
Now, that leads me on to my next question, actually. How would you make a mold for this coat of arms? I know now they make them out of latex, don't they, and pour it all in
Yeah.
and it comes out perfectly, but that wouldn't have been the case in the early days. So how is a traditional mold? Does that vary from, 1600 to 1700 again?
Well, I think not, because, rubber wasn't available then. So anything in low relief could be carved out of a timber mold. If it was being repeated lots of times, they'd go to the effort of making a wooden mold for the car. But the process is very different making. Remember, if you go back to the first half of the 17th century and back to 1500, they didn't have adhesives with which to stick lime plaster to lime plaster. So the process had to be sort of a wet process from start to finish. So lime and chalk was pressed into a wooden mold, and it was a very stiff consistency because we know they were beating it in with mallet. So they hammered it into the wooden mold. But this had to be done whilst the background plaster was still wet and soft,
Mm.
because that cast was then immediately taken out while still wet. The mold was then dusted with some chalk or stone dust. The cast put back into it, and then the wooden mold used to press the cast onto the ceiling.
How amazing.
And that adhesive is the fact that you've got one wet piece of plaster sticking into another piece of wet plaster that's on the ceiling, and that's the adhesive. And that's why nothing ever falls off an early ceiling. because it's all one consistent coat. Whereas if you go to 1700, then gypsum was introduced. And so they were still using wooden molds, but then casting gypsum into them. That was setting hard before it was taken out of the mold. And then it was glued into place with more gypsum. So the process has changed enormously in that period, you know.
Incredible. Was there still a similar amount of horsehair in the early version you were talking about?
Oh, the early casts, yes, they usually have approximately 10 times the amount of hair that you'd find in a Georgian plaster. Because, as I said, the hair is doing two jobs. You know, it's holding everything together, and it's quite a fragile material. You know, there's nothing, when you put sharp, coarse sand into a mortar, it stabilizes the mix, so it makes it less likely to crack. It makes it harder, and sharp sand locks together. The angular nature of the particles mean that they lock together, and the lime is just a glue that on the surface of each particle that holds the particles of lime in suspension. And then, of course, the lime turns back into stone, absorbing the carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and it becomes this hard, solid sheet. But if you imagine putting something similar to a powdered chalk with a fine lime putty, it's a pretty fragile material. So they needed to absolutely bulk it up with hair to make it so that it didn't fall to pieces. But then once it's dried, it's pretty tough and very flexible, as I said.
There must be a limit in the depth of a rose and the weight, because surely if you go too far, the whole thing can just fall down.
Yeah, it can. I mean, but because of they're very tenacious, the early plasters are very tenacious. So we can put that plaster on. I've applied it to a wall 7 inches thick in one coat, and it stays, and it doesn't crack, and it just dries, and it goes pretty
Amazing.
tough. You couldn't do that with a sand mortar. But on a ceiling, of course, you're fighting gravity. And so we found we did a brand new Elizabethan ceiling about 5 years ago in a house on a barrel vault, and we were casting rosettes about sort of 6 inches, or maybe no, 8 inches across, these rosettes. We were casting them into a reverse plaster mold rather than a wooden one. And in the lime and chalk, we were forcing it in, taking it out, dusting the mold, putting it back, and then pressing it onto the ceiling. And they slide because of the shape of the barrel vault. Unless they're hanging straight down, if they're on the side, they slide.
Like a jelly mold.
Yes.
Moving down.
And so one of those rosettes on that ceiling, because there's about 30, they sit on the point of a rib where it comes to a point, and then there's a rosette. And one of them has slipped off, but it's still kind of in contact. But my son put the rosette on, it was tea time, we went for tea, came back, and it had slid down, but it was still sort of attached. We considered taking it off and then said, no, let's just leave it, because it's one of the strange little quirky things that you often find on early ceilings, is that the geometry can be quite good, but when you look closely, you know, you might have two fleur-de-lis that should meet point on, but they're actually like that. And it's one of the lovely things, I think, that, you know, maybe the plasterers were just having a bad day and got them done and then said, they're not right, but let's leave it. And it's that imperfection that we really like about those early ceilings.
Yeah.
When we look at the Georgian ceilings, they're geometrically perfect, and I think they lose something for that.
No, absolutely. So how long does it take then somebody to be, you know, up to a good standard from when they started as an apprenticeship? It must take an awful long time.
Yeah, I think I look back at my own career, and when I've been working for 10 years, it dawned on me how little I knew before. And I figured out that after 10 years, you're fairly competent in most things, but then it's 20 years before you're good at most things. And then it's probably 40 years before you can look at just about everything and go, it'll be fine, don't worry about it. You know, because as you become mature, so much more confident in everything you do. And young people work each year, they worry about little details because they don't have that confidence of 40 years or the maturity to be able to say, it's going to be fine, relax, and it will work. I suppose that's what comes with experience, isn't it?
Yeah.
When I was young, and I was talking earlier about needing to work with older plasterers to get good experience, I went back and worked with my college tutor, Mr. Ford, on a big project in Norwich. This was after my father had died in the 90s. And he put me with a couple of plasterers, forget their name, but they were great. They were in their 60s then, and I was about 30-ish. And we had an issue with the decorative elements. We were putting up enormous centerpieces in this public building, the assembly rooms in Norwich. And the centerpieces were about 7 or 8 feet across. They were huge. And they were 2 feet deep off the ceiling, sitting on like a plaster bell background that was fixed to the ceiling and shaped. And different people were involved in different parts of the process. One person had made the bell shape, and one person had made these enormous acanthus leaves about the size of a dustbin lid. And we fitted the first bell, got the first acanthus leaf and put it up against it, and it didn't in any way come close to the same arc. There was a 2-inch gap between the middle of the acanthus leaf and the bell. And I said to the old plasterer, I said, oh no, what are we going to do? It's a disaster. And he snapped it across his knee and said, there you go. It fits just fine. It's absolutely fine. Now, he said, screw that in place and joint it up, and no one will ever know. And it's still there today, and they look perfect. It's that experience of being able to say, don't worry about it. It'll work. Crash, bang, and it looks beautiful. And we find that, I think, that's always gone on. The things that we do now are no different to the things that were being done 300 years ago or whatever. Find those little things that have been there for 200 years, 300 years. And I can recognize exactly the conversation that those guys had that day. Where they were like, oh no, what are we going to do? Sort of thing, I love that sort of tangible evidence of plasterers that we find. We find fingerprints in
amazing
plaster that are 300 or 400 years old, and of course, inevitably, people putting initials and things in. And we still do all of that today.
It's amazing because, when I work on projects, I get moments of real connection with the people that installed, say, some paneling or a staircase. Sometimes you have an eerie moment and you get such a strong connection. And then you wonder who installed the staircase or the paneling. Where did they live? Were they from this country? Were they, native here, or were they from abroad? And those, obviously, I don't find fingerprints on paneling, but even you take a panel off and you'll see a late 17th century nail that has never seen the light of day, a handmade nail. Just something as simple as that. And I'll stare at that and I drive my team mad because I say, look at this, look how it's made. And it was handmade, and the person and that one tiny, tiny thing, your imagination can just go wild. That's what I love about it.
Me too. It's that physical, tangible connection with history. I found some nails on the back of a ceiling at Stowe House in Buckinghamshire. And there was a small pile of about a dozen lath nails, just as you mentioned. They weren't used. They were just in a pile on the back of the laths. And I think that probably the person doing the lathing, this was around about 1710, I think. The person doing the lathing had probably had them in his hand or in his pocket and put them up there while he went for a cup of tea or something. And then when he came back, he'd forgotten that he'd put them there, and then carried on with some more, and they just got left there for 300 years.
Oh, incredible.
And then we found them. And I think, like you say, I could imagine just putting them there. Maybe it was the end of the day. They thought, I'll get those in the morning, and then forgot, went home and got an earful, and came back in the morning in a bad mood and started again. Yeah, we leave the same evidence in some ways. We hide a lot of things on site. When we run cornices, of course, the cornice is often hollow, on wooden brackets and lathing, and so there's a space behind. So we put newspapers, sometimes the odd newspaper, if there's an interesting, we'll write our names in the newspaper and pop that up there. We leave a lot of scallop shells because the scallop shell is the symbol of the business we chose. And so we often hide scallop shells in the plaster, behind a flower or behind a coat of arms or something. Somebody will go up to paint it and say, oh, there's a scallop shell up here. I wonder what that's doing. And hopefully they'll tie it back.
Oh, that's great. And what's nice is that you probably find a lot of these original things from the past, like fingerprints and the nails, because it's out of reach, isn't it? Nobody is going to go up on the ceiling. It's not like a piece of paneling that somebody would, a maintenance man can take off in the 1920s and then discover something. Up there, it's out of reach. So I imagine you can find some really amazing things, actually.
Yeah, well, I mean, we don't find anything of any value. We'd never find any treasure, but we do find some lovely things like people's initials scratched into the plaster. For I found a piece of glass that had a plumber's name scratched into it and a date, I think it was 1857. So they'd obviously got a diamond ring, I'm guessing, and they'd scratched into the glass their name and left that up on a ceiling. And yeah, we sometimes find, the fingerprint thing is kind of fascinating because it was on a cornice from about 1650, and the finishing coat had come off the cornice in one place where there'd been a leaky pipe. So the finishing coat of plaster came off, and behind it was a crack in the backing coat. And you could see where the plasterer had put his fingers into the plaster while it was still wet and pulled that crack together. There was just lots of his fingerprints in there. So that was fascinating.
Oh, yeah. The only time I found fingerprints is it's very different. We were taking some paneling off in a house in Oxfordshire, and we came across some lagging that was smothered in asbestos. And there were lots of fingerprints and just marks where they just slapped it all on with their hands. So that's the only time I've ever of course, shut the site down, call the team in. But
asbestos. It is fascinating, and in some respects, it's what draws us to the trade as well, isn't it? It's not just the job; it's wanting to know how people worked historically, what tools they used, the conditions. I think we would compare the work that we do now that was done historically. Biggest difference would have to be light, because we now run electric leads and we have great lights that illuminate the workspace beautifully and we can see everything. Of course, pre-electricity, they had none of that, did they? So they were working with candles, torches, maybe, gas lamps.
Yeah.
Yeah, it must have been smelly and difficult to work. And if you're working on a barrel vault ceiling, for example, you haven't even got any windows in the room. The windows are all below the scaffold level. And so to illuminate that space to work in it must have been extremely difficult.
I've just thought of something, actually. When a plastered ceiling went in, let's say 1650, the environment of that building would have been, a lot damper. Surrounding wood would have had a higher moisture content. How does that affect you now? Because these buildings have central heating in them. So everything's dried out. All the mortar, the bricks, the wood, everything has dried out. And that's surely not that suitable for lime.
No, it's very complicated. So yes, you're right. So when the houses are first plastered, the walls are full of water, aren't they? Because, they might be a couple of feet thick or something in that region. And the core of that wall is still wet from when it's built. And that residual moisture has to come out. So it passes out over a period of years through the lime plaster and enabling the carbonation process to continue. Whereas if lime plaster dries out too quickly, of course, it stops carbonating and then doesn't really achieve its full set. So what we try and do is to recreate as best as we can that scenario. So we feed a wall with moisture as much as we can possibly get into it, before we start plastering it. So externally, that's easy because we could just turn the hose pipes onto it, can't we? And we'll soak a wall down multiple times until it kind of stops taking moisture in. And then we'll quickly cover it with a coat of plaster to hold that moisture into the wall. We call it a reservoir of water. So we'll feed the wall with moisture, trap that moisture in, and then that moisture gets slow released through the external render, enabling it to carbonate. But of course, internally, that's tricky when people have got carpets and you know, in a house where you're trying to repair. So we do the best we can with sort of pump action sprayers, and we try to feed the wall with water as much as we can, but it is tricky.
It must be
And
tricky. Yeah,
it has to be managed. You know, we will be getting water into the wall as best as we can, then coating it with plaster, and then for the next few days we'll be wetting the plaster down again to try and keep it damp as much as we can.
Yeah, it must be difficult because even the stud work behind would typically be now around about 12% moisture content. Now, back in 1650, it was probably more like 18, 20. And then it didn't dry out very quickly because the building only had, you know, an open fire. So therefore it didn't have central heating. So our buildings have just dried out so much, haven't they?
Largely, yeah. A lot of we're plastering the Temple of Piety at the moment in Royal Stoodling, just near Ripon. And that's the opposite. That's very damp. We're having trouble getting it to dry out. So
Oh,
that's
okay.
staying longer than we'd like it to. Generally on stud work, I kind of want the first coat to dry out pretty quick because, of course, when we can then put our second coat over it, and we can introduce more moisture at that point into the first coat because carbonation can stop and the mortar goes dry. But you can kick it off again by just wetting the wall down again. And then if you wet that first coat down, put another coat of plaster over it, trapping that moisture in, you're kind of starting the carbonation process again and trapping more moisture in the first coat again.
Right.
So it's that's very straightforward. It is really the dry masonry walls that are the issue, where you come back the following day and the previous day's work has gone dry, then you know you're struggling a bit. But yeah, it is tricky that, but there's nothing we can do. It is what it is.
I went onto your website and I saw these incredible images of Ickham Place.
Yeah.
And I'm going to encourage the listeners to go onto your website and go to the portfolio section and have a look at these images because it's absolutely fascinating. And I just wondered if you could talk us through how you did that. And firstly, can I just ask a question about the laths? And were laths also a different species from region to region?
Well, it depends on the period because the Victorians used a lot of pine, Scots pine, but prior to that, Georgian and Elizabethan work, it tends to be oak or chestnut. But also, as you say, regionally, if you go into the fens where we live, you get a lot of water reeds. And
Of
so
course,
you get a lot of ceilings that are covered in reeds and the walls are covered in reeds. But it does tend to be usually oak or chestnut.
Right. So the first image shows these beautiful laths. Do you do the laths as well? Do you have, does somebody else come in and do that?
We don't make the laths, but
No, but you
we
fit them.
Yeah. Yes, we do. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, and then it looks like you've marked out with, it looks, if I'm guessing, sort of a watery mix of plaster on a brush.
It's lime wash.
It's lime wash.
Yeah. So the reasoning behind that was we were using a product. It was a pre-mixed lime and chalk that was beautiful for making the work. So it behaved very much like the original mixes in that it was super sticky and very stable at great depths. So you could put it on 2 or 3 inches thick and not worry about shrinkage cracking. It was very stable, but it had one issue with it. It didn't seem to want to stick to itself. So you couldn't apply it in multiple coats. It wanted to delaminate. If you put a coat of it on top of a previous coat, it wanted to, the two would delaminate. So we had to develop the technique that we were using to create that ceiling based on the fact that the performance of the mortar wouldn't stick to itself very well. So to get over that, we ran the ribs first directly onto the laths and the painting onto the pattern. So traditionally what was done with those ceilings was the first coat of plaster was laid on, and then the pattern was scratched into that first coat of plaster while it was still wet. The layout of the ribs, the position of the rosettes, all of the other scrap. And we know that because one of the repairs we did at Eightthorpe Palace was the removal of a smoke detector that had been put in the place of an original Jacobean pendant. So they'd taken the pendant down, thrown it away, and fixed this bright orange smoke detector in the 1960s or 70s or whatever. So we took that down, and behind that we could see the first coat of plaster, and all of the lines showing the intersection of the ribs were marked there just by scratching into it. So we know that's what they did. We know that was evidence, but we weren't able to do that on that ceiling because of the performance of the material. So we developed the process to put the ribs on first, lime wash the position of the pattern onto the laths, to put the ribs on and run all of the ribs, and then to fill in the spaces in between. And it worked very well, but subsequent to that, we've changed the material we use. We now use something called lime coat, which is still just chalk and lime, but does stick to itself. So we're now doing those ceilings much more authentically than that first one. But
and the ribs, I know that obviously plaster has to be pushed through enough to form a key at the back so it stays. So how do you go about, you get the trowel, put the first load of plaster on. Are you pushing that into the laths to make sure that you're getting a key?
Yeah, you have to apply some pressure. And once you've done that a few times, you do it without thinking, because you know how hard you have to press it to push it.
Okay. Yeah, interesting.
But it does naturally, as you wipe the trowel across the surface of the plaster, it does naturally just push through, and then gravity takes hold and it just folds over.
Yeah.
If you're on a ceiling and the keys fold in the direction of application.
I see.
As you move your trowel across the ceiling, the keys go through and then they follow you. They fold over as you move along.
That's fascinating, because I see so many lath and plaster ceilings, and I'm going to look out for that next time to see which way the trowel was going.
Yeah, exactly.
And then you use some molds to create the ribs?
Yes, so there should be an image on the site there of a handheld wooden mold, like I was describing earlier, with the chamfer on the back, and then you're wiping it into the chamfer to trowel the surface of the rib.
And then you've done that, then you've created the rows, and that's come out of a mold as well. So you've used
so we used a plaster mold for that. We couldn't find anybody to carve a reverse rose mold for us, so we made one out of plaster, and now have someone that will carve them for us. So we did that, and then Ana Castilla Villa worked with us, and she did all of the bosses at the convergence of the ribs.
Oh yeah,
she made those in situ. So very handmade and very simple.
I think it's absolutely beautiful. And what I love about it is that, as you've mentioned earlier, it's not perfect. And that says it all for me. I love seeing work like this, where it's not absolutely perfectly symmetrical. It's obviously hand done. And it's the real work of art.
If you think about plastering at that time, 1600 or whenever, the whole process was in the hands of the plasterers, wasn't it? The creation of the molds, the creation of the tools, the running of everything. Nothing was sort of mechanized, as it were. Nothing was. The skill and everything was in the hands of the plasterers, what I'm trying to say. But as we move through the periods, it gradually transfers into less of the skill being in the hands of the plasterers and more of the sort of skill taken out of the trade. So we get to the 18th century where lots of plaster is just being thrown into molds and then allowed to go hard and just fixed. It's finished in a factory and then fixed. End of the 19th century, and we get to fibrous plasterwork, 1850 onwards, where everything is just thrown into molds in a factory and dried and then brought to site and nailed into place. And all of a sudden, the skill of the plasterer has diminished enormously. The plasterers on site have become just fixers of bits of plaster that are made in a factory. It's gradually become less and less skillful from those early plasterers that were making everything by hand. And they were great artists. You know, if you look at some of the work they made, the Abbot from Frithlestock in Devon are probably the best documented early plasterers. They were around about sort of 1600. And we know quite a bit about them because John Abbott had a book in which he drew his designs and made notes. And that book survived and is in the Devon Museum in Exeter. And also his tools survived, and they're also in the Devon Museum. So we know quite a bit about him. We don't know much about the other plasterers other than if you visit the website of Claire Gapper, Dr. Claire Gapper, a good old friend of mine. She's an architectural historian who's carried out more research than anyone else, I think, in the world on early plasterwork. And her website is called British Renaissance Plasterwork, and it's a vast tome of information about who the plasterers were, what they were doing, who they were working for, how much they were charging, and various other information. If you get on that website, you can get lost for weeks.
I'll visit that. Absolutely.
The Abbots did beautiful work. You know, we looked recently at some work he did in Frithlestock Church and also in a house not far from Frithlestock, where he did an overmantel, and the modelling of the figures are just sublime. It's so beautiful, kind of naive but beautiful as well.
Wonderful. And just finishing on Ickham Place, how long did that approximately take you from start to finish?
That ceiling took 5 weeks.
Did it?
For just me and my sons and Anna, so just 4 people, 5 weeks start to finish.
That's good.
So it happens very quickly because it kind of has to. Because as I said earlier, work wet on wet. So you can't leave it to dry and then start doing more work. So it does just naturally happen quite quickly. Yeah, we do occasionally we get asked to do a ceiling for someone that maybe can't afford to pay for it. And so we offer them the opportunity to have the ceiling, but to provide it as a course. So we did one in Sandwich in Kent in January of this year. A sort of a 4 or 5 square meter room. They wanted a new ceiling in the style of, where is it? A house in Cumbria. No, escapes me. They couldn't afford to pay for it, although we're actually pretty reasonably priced, I think. And they said, no, we don't think we can do it. So we said, look, we can provide you the ceiling. We're going to bring 10 students in over 2 weeks, and all you have to do is feed them and us and house us, and you get the ceiling for free. So we did that. And after 4 days, one half of the ceiling was finished. So what's that, about 9, maybe 10 square meters? And it's start to finish in 4 days, from first coat to all the ribs being finished, decorative details added in.
Amazing.
It is amazing. And the same the second week. So we finished the ceiling in sort of 8 days, start to finish.
Crikey. Yeah, as you say, you can't hang around and leave it and let it dry and then come back a week. You know, you've got to start and finish.
And it lends itself to that because you can put it on so thick, so quickly. You know, by the end of the first day, the pattern is marked and the ribs are beginning to appear. And by the end of day 2, most of the ribs are done.
It reminds me, Philip, the first images of the ribs going on, we've got bees and they seal the beehive joints with propolis, and it sort of looks a little bit like that at the early stages where you're sort of, you know, just dabbing it all along. And it reminds me of what my bees create at home a little bit. It's
That's interesting. There's a bee on that ceiling at Ickham, actually.
Oh, is there? Is there? Okay.
We'll model up insects and hide them in places. And the contracts manager, a good friend, George, kept talking about the centre of the flowers being pollen. And we said, no, seeds. Surely they're seeds. And we had this thing ongoing for a few days. And so as a bit of a joke, we modelled for George a little bee on one of the flowers. I mean, we then added a few other insects for the children in the house to find.
Oh, that's nice. How did you end up in Myanmar and Afghanistan and Transylvania? What happened there?
Transylvania came first. That was following the downfall of Ceausescu, the dictator. I mean, Transylvania itself is a remarkable area of Europe. It was originally owned by Hungary. If we go back to sort of 1500, it was owned by the King of Hungary, but it was a very empty, lawless area. In order to create a sort of a safer place for people to travel through, I think the Saxons were having a tough time, and he invited the Saxons to come and live in Transylvania. He would give them the land for free, and they would create villages and farms, and they then could live happily and safely, which they did. And the Saxons, well, the people from Saxony were very industrious, hardworking, and law-abiding, and they built beautiful houses on a very simple design, all the same, all the way down all of the streets in all of the villages, and there's maybe 20 or 30 villages. They built beautiful timber frame churches, and they lived there then pretty much until Ceausescu was shot. So descendants of the original Saxons, and they knew how to look after the houses, how to repair them, how to restore them. And Ceausescu, the dictator from Romania, was deposed, shot, whatever. And the German government offered the Saxons the opportunity to go home to Germany. And in some of the villages, 70% of the people left overnight. Because remember, the borders had been closed for so long. So all of a sudden, you have this World Heritage Site that quite quickly begins to fall to pieces. The Romanian government move in homeless Romanians who have no idea how to look after the buildings. The buildings are like a light timber frame structure, softwood, filled in with unburnt clay bricks and plastered with clay mortars. Quite fragile, but everything's recyclable. So the Saxons would strip a building down of all its materials, put to one side, repair the frame, put all of the same materials back into it, and plaster it with the earth mortar. The Romanians didn't know that, and they started using cement and putting UPVC windows into them, and the houses started to fall over. So I think an old friend, Ian Pritchett, replied to an advert in a magazine, and he put together a team of people to go over to try and teach English conservation to the Romanians. But actually what we found on arrival was that the Saxons didn't do conservation. They did take down and rebuild. And so it was one of those sort of, we did the best we could in that difficult situation. But in the end, I think that the houses had to be taken down periodically and rebuilt. It was just the way they were designed. But that gave me experience in working abroad and also working with translators. And when it came to Myanmar, I answered an advert in a magazine and was interviewed on Zoom. And I think it was the experience of working with translators that got me that role. That was working for the Turquoise Mountain Trust, which is a charitable organization whose goal is to help former areas of conflict to rebuild historic buildings, And they had this project running in Myanmar, which had just come out of being ruled by the military for 60 years or so and was becoming democratic, or so we hoped. And there was a lot of colonial buildings because the British were there, very influential in the 19th and early 20th centuries. And the colonial buildings were still there, but were gradually beginning to fall to pieces. And so the locals were tearing them down and having companies come in and put up concrete office blocks and things. And they were falling to pieces very quickly because the climate there is very harsh. It's very moist and everything tends to go moldy. So you get these big concrete structures going up that turn green very quickly. So the goal of the Turquoise Mountain Trust really was to educate, to show how colonial buildings could be restored and reused, and how beautiful they were to look at, but how actually beautiful they were to live in, because they were cool in a very hot climate. And they brought me over to work with them on their first project, which was 51 Merchant Street in the centre of Yangon. And it was complicated because you imagine the social circumstances. There's no real leadership after the Second World War other than the military. And the British have been kicked out. So all of the British buildings are empty. And people start to move into them, but nobody really owns them. And maybe 20 families would live in one building, but nobody would have responsibility for the roof when it started to leak. And so the families would then hang a sheet of polythene in their room to divert the water down the inside walls to the family of the room below. And they would then put a sheet of polythene up in their room to divert the water down to the next floor, and so on and so forth. And so the buildings, of course, just sat there rotting, and they were full of families. So the Turquoise Mountain Trust had to convince the families living there that even though they didn't own it, they were going to be allowed to move back in once the house was restored. And they managed to achieve that at Merchant Street, even with some shacks that had been knocked up out of timber on the outside that were just leaning against the outside wall. They moved all of the people out temporarily, restored the building, and then moved all the people back in. And of course, they were delighted because they now had this super lovely, dry space that was all nicely decorated, and they were very happy. And it was done very traditionally. Lime plaster, lime washes, great joinery from the local carpenters using their local teak. It was a great success. And then they tackled another building, which was called it was a former department store, but I can't think what it was called. Something like the Burma. No, it had then become, once it stopped, after the war, it stopped being a department store and became the Burmese Tourist Building as an office for government administration. And they restored that building too, and that became more of a public space, like offices for startups and galleries for local artists and a coffee shop. That was a great success. And then from there, they then asked me to go to Kabul in Afghanistan to set up a course to teach local people traditional plastering. But of course, Afghani traditional plastering is very different to English. And on the very first day on site, they took me into a new building. So the Turquoise Mountain Trust bought or took control of a self-contained village in the center of Kabul, which was an earth structure that had been almost leveled. I think it was only 1 meter high when they took it, and was covered in piles of refuse. And they excavated it with local labor, rebuilt the whole structure, and then started to make, I think there were 3 schools in this structure. It was 150 houses, 3 schools, various public spaces, baths, 2 bathhouses, and offices, all self-contained within this earthen structure. It brought me in to try and help local students understand traditional plasterwork. On the very first day, they took me into the newly built souvenir shop, and it had been newly plastered in earth plaster, decoratively, beautifully plastered by someone else. And my first question was, who did this? Who did this gorgeous earth plasterwork? It's wonderful. And they said, oh, just some local plasterers. And so, of course, my next question was, why aren't they teaching the course? Why have you just brought me thousands of miles to teach a course? We've got people in the town that know exactly how to do it. So we set up a meeting with the local plasterers. They kept giggling at me, and I asked the interpreter why they were giggling, and it turned out that my surname means plaster in Afghanistan.
That's funny.
It's hilarious.
Yeah.
So them, I was Mr. Plaster, you see. So we got on great with those guys, and they're going to come back and teach the course with me. And they would take it on then to run it. As it happened, of course, the Americans pulled out, and the situation became unsafe for us to be there. So we didn't go back. The Turquoise Mountain Trust is still there. Reports I get are that actually it is safe to be there, but for the time being, doing that course. But I would hope to go back sometime.
What an experience.
Oh, it
What
was
an
fantastic.
experience.
Yes, it was fantastic. It was thrilling,
Oh,
but also a little bit scary.
yeah, of course. But you
So,
know you're living your life, don't you, when you're doing things like that?
yeah, absolutely. I always say yes. Whenever people
Oh.
say, will you come and do this? I always think, yes, definitely.
And then what
Um,
happened? Your sons were running the business in the UK when you were away.
yeah, yes, that's right. When I'm away, the boys carry on. And they're now 26 and 23.
Mm.
Um, so they're perfectly capable. They're highly skilled, well motivated, very creative in their own ways, and have no worries that they will take the business on when I'm finishing.
Mm.
So we're in what we're calling the 10-year handover. So I was 62 years ago, and I decided that when I'm 70, I'm going to retire. We're now 2 years into a 10-year handover, so they're gradually taking on more responsibility
Mm.
so that they don't have the same scenario that I had when I was 23 of being thrown in. And it might be a bad thing, that I'm being a bit too soft with them. We've kind of come full circle now, haven't we?
Yeah,
I'm being I'm
yeah,
being a bit soft with them, whereas I ought to just disappear one day and say, it's yours.
yeah.
Off you
Yeah. So what do you think, how do you feel about the future of your trade, and what is the future of the next generation for traditional plastering? Are you hopeful? Is there much interest?
I think we're in a great place. We're in a far better situation now than we were 30 years ago. Just thinking about the respect we now have for tradesmen, it's enormously better than it was. We respect tradesmen. Tradesmen are looked after. The conditions on site are much better. Pay is better.
Mm.
And I think we have an appreciation in society now for the trades. Young people are now leaving school and being given an option to go to university or perhaps look for a trade an apprenticeship in a trade. My eldest son could have gone to university but chose not to. He took an apprenticeship instead. I think people see it as a career with prospects, whereas when I left school in the 70s, it was something that kids did that couldn't do anything else. I
Mm.
went to college in Norwich, as I said, and there was a short entrance exam to take that required a bit of mathematics and a bit of English. And the mathematics was a series of questions regarding the numbers 0 to 9, and you had to select the middle number and add the numbers together and what was the sum and that sort of thing. It was very simple, basic mathematics. And there were kids in the class that couldn't do it. And because most of the kids that were on that course with me didn't want to be there, they were there simply because there was nothing, they couldn't do anything else.
Mm.
Whereas I think young people now coming into the industry want to be there. What we tend not to see are 16-year-olds coming into the industry. And I think that's kind of right. I think most people that come into the industry that we see anyway are in their mid-20s. They've perhaps started another career and didn't like it. They've maybe been to university and decided they want to make something with their hands and get drawn towards traditional buildings, which is great because, if you take a 16-year-old on as a business and a year in, they decide to do something else, they can just jump ship and leave.
Mm.
They've cost you quite a bit of money and time in that first year where they produce very little. This is a generalization, of course. There are exceptions to that. I know that. Whereas if you recruit someone that's 25, they generally have tried something else and they know what they want to do. They do want to do
Mm.
plastering and they will stick at it. So the amount of time and resources that you invest in that person is money well spent. So I have this idea that we shouldn't ask 16-year-olds to go and get a job. We should offer them an option of volunteering. anywhere in the world on projects, and let them just go and explore the world, and pay them to do that, and come into the world of work when they're 19 or something like that. And they're a bit more.
I think that's a fantastic idea, and I completely agree, because you literally, when you're 16, you haven't got a clue, and unless you're, ruled with an iron rod and you're forced to go into a certain profession, you just don't know what you want to do. You're too young. You're still a kid. And by doing that, I went traveling when I was, I think, 19, actually. So I was a little bit older. It changed me. It completely changed me. I only went for about 7 months and I came back a different person. I was living in a small village in West Sussex and very naive. And I went to Hawaii and Los Angeles and New Zealand, and it was incredible. And a hitchhike around the South Island. And I really grew up and sort of found myself and who I was. And that really changed me. So I completely agree. When youngsters say to me, oh, not sure what to do, and they're stressing about it, these 16, 17-year-olds, I say, take your time. Absolutely take your time. And don't jump into a job that you aren't passionate about and you're not going to like when you're older. Take some time off and go traveling. Travel around the world for a year. Then come back and have a think about it.
Yeah, exactly. Don't bother the employers until you're ready to work.
Yeah.
But we've stopped taking on young people from that sort of 16, 17-year-old bracket because of the disappointment. Been disappointed so many times. One young man we put a lot of effort into decided to go and work installing UHPVC windows as a career, because he could get £1 a day extra or something like that. And at that time, we were working on Apethorpe Palace, and him and I had spent an afternoon with Prince Charles talking about the building and demonstrating things to him. And yet he still left and went and fitted UPVC windows. So it was really disappointing. And I said, then that's the last young person I'll employ.
Oh, incredible. I had a similar situation with a young lad who worked for me, again, a bit older, but he was very good. And he ended up leaving and going to work for a kitchen company because he could get more money per week. He didn't think long term. Oh, hold on, this is a dying trade. I could be a real specialist here.
And the rewards in the long term are good, aren't they?
Yeah.
We've been working with the Prince's Foundation, now the King's Foundation, for about 20 years, offering placements to their students. And it's such a huge success. I'm a bit worried about it at the moment. The funding has changed. It's not as good as it was, but it was self-funding. So a student from any background could come and do the course and not worry about funding, whereas it's become a little less funded. Of course, not all young people have. We're kind of working on that a bit at the moment, trying to find a solution for that. But we've had something in the region of about 12 to 14 students in that 20 years. And all of them have been in that sort of 25 to 30 age bracket. They've all actually been women, young women, and all of them are still in the industry today. It's just a huge success. So it kind of reinforces that thing we were talking about post 25 people knowing what they really want to do. And it means that when we invest in a student, it's a really good investment. So now there's a dozen or more young women working in the traditional plastering industry that weren't there before. I think, and you asked me what I thought of the circumstances of the trade, the situation. I think we're in a really good position.
That's great.
I think we're in a really good position. I think I don't hear of any jobs that aren't getting done because they can't find people to do it, which wasn't the case 30 years ago. I follow a couple of groups on Facebook. They're plasterers chat groups, and lots of standard modern house plastering plasterers are doing a bit of lime work. So a little bit of lath and plaster or a little bit of lime plastering on walls. They generally know why they're doing it, to help the building breathe, because it's a pre-1920s building and doesn't have a damp course. So, and there's hundreds of those, literally hundreds. So I think we're in a really good position. I think we need to keep at it. Commissions are the key. So working commissions are the key to training, I think. You can train as many people in a workshop as you like, but they need to be out on site working. So the numbers are good, but we need to keep that going. I read a report in the paper a few weeks ago about Parliament is the next big building project. They're going to require something like 100 traditional plasterers they claim over a period of 40 years. You could replaster the whole Houses of Parliament in 10 years with 100 plasterers. So I don't know what they're going to be doing, but I think it's a slight over exaggeration. I think there's plenty of people in the traditional craft education industry who are trying to generate more work in the training sector. I think there's a lot of scaremongering going on about dying, and there's no shortage of traditional plasterers anymore. We need to I think the thing with lime plastering as well is that the skills are very easily transferable from someone that's learned to plaster new houses.
I
so
see.
that we still use a hawk and trowel and a float and a feather edge to straighten walls. The only difference is the materials, and the materials to be perfectly honest, the materials are easier to work with than modern materials because they don't have that gypsum set that happens as soon as you put water with it. You've got a 2-hour window to finish that wall, or it's going to be hard. With lime, you can control the speed of the set. So in reality, they're easier to work with. If one follows a few golden rules, you can't go wrong. So I think, we could take 100 plasterers that have never worked with lime before, and we could teach them in a matter of days how to transfer the skills to lime plastering, and you could put them in the Houses of Parliament, and there you go. They're talking about taking up half of the traditional plasterers from the country to work in Buckingham Palace, but not Buckingham Palace, sorry, the Houses of Parliament. We've worked there. I don't think traditional plasterers would want to work in Parliament, to be frank. It's too hot.
Yeah.
It's like a hothouse in there.
Really good that you have that foundation. That's very different from my trade, because I was taught as an antique furniture restorer in the Brighton lanes and above an antique dealer's, but there was about 12, 15 restorers. That's how I was taught. And those places don't exist anymore. Now,
Right.
So for my industry, there's nothing like you can bring people in from modern plastering into traditional plastering, which is great. Because the antique trade is dead now. You don't get the traditional restorers anymore. And so it's a real problem. But when I hear you speak and say how successful the King's Foundation was, one of the things that I would love to do is teach young people what I know. But it's very difficult without the support, isn't it? When you're a one-man band and you bring somebody in and all the red tape and the politics around it, the health and safety, and then the time that you have to take to teach these individuals, it's incredibly difficult and quite a strain on a small business unless you're getting that funding. So, but I feel guilty now speaking to you because I really should have a team of young people and we really should be out there working on all these amazing buildings. And so maybe that's something I've got to consider.
Oh, but as you say, the problem is you invest all that time and effort into a young person and then they disappear.
Yeah.
And do something. If you could contract them to stay with you for 7 years, as was historically the case, that, until they'd finished their 7-year apprenticeship, they couldn't legally go out and trade as anything, then I'm not suggesting we do that now. Those days are gone. But there's needs to be some way of doing it without you losing out financially and becoming frustrated with it. Yeah, and you're right, because of course there is a need for furniture restoration and repairs. We've got houses in the house now that need repairing, and the guy that used to do it for us has retired, so we don't have it locally that we know that knows how to use animal skin glue and
exactly
effect that repair.
I know, and the thing is that if you to now, for the last 20 odd years, I've been restoring joinery in listed buildings, exactly the same methods and techniques, just on a bigger scale. So you can go from an antique furniture restorer into joinery restoration. So, and that is, we desperately need more people coming in. When we worked at the King's Drawing Room at Kensington, I remember our benches were lined up, our animal glue was boiling away, we had our carving chisels on our planes. 90% of the tools and materials that we were using were pretty much, well, incredibly similar to what they used in 1724. That was the date of the paneling. So hardly anything had changed. And I had a moment one day, I thought, who will be doing this in 20 years' time? Who will be doing this for these hand planes and the glue? And who is going to be looking after the paneling and all the joinery? So it's yeah.
Hope. We know a company in Gloucester, south of Manchester, called Jack Badger. I don't know whether you've heard of
Yes,
them.
I've seen some of the stuff on social media, actually. I need to contact them because they look like they do some really good stuff.
They're really nice guys. They're very nice guys. So they're a fairly young company. They have a very similar approach to work that we do, where they try and make everything authentic. So they don't use machinery, or if they do, they use it sparingly. Everything is hand planed. Everything is adzed to flatten it. They don't use sandpaper for anything. So they're trying to create joinery in the style of the 17th century, and they're doing it. They're making new paneling, which is made exactly the same as paneling was made in the 17th century.
Oh, fantastic.
Using the same materials, the same techniques, the same tools. And there's 20 of them. So there's around about 20 people in that workshop in Glossop making things in that very early style and using the same technology. So there's a glimmer of hope there. It's not restoration, it's very much new work. And they're not pretending it's anything else. But they are hand carving everything. Any carving that gets done is hand carved. And they're doing great work. And as I said, they're quite a young company. So there's a glimmer of hope there for you. And
Yes.
I would recommend that you reach out and speak to them, and you'll like them. I know you will.
You
should
maybe they get them on the podcast. Exactly. Yeah, I was going to say.
Yeah. Get Ben Naylor on the podcast. Yeah.
No, yeah, absolutely. That sounds like a good plan. So we're coming towards the end now, Philip. Now, for anybody interested in learning more about plaster conservation and traditional plastering, can you recommend any resources, books, organisations? What would you say?
Yeah, there's various ways to get into it. The SBAB are always a good point of contact, and they offer some good training courses in various aspects of traditional plaster work. So that's worth looking into. The King's, for somebody a bit more serious, perhaps, a young person looking to start a new career, the King's Foundation is brilliant still, and I would highly recommend that. That's a sort of 6-month course of classroom teaching, workshop teaching, and placement experiences. So it's a well-rounded course, that. And like all courses with us, I suppose, it's a never-ending course. So the idea is that you gain experience, but then on your placements, you meet someone that will take you on and give you some work to carry on with after the course is finished. So there's lots of literature available, through the internet, but there's also lots and lots of books about traditional plastering. There's Miller's Plain and Decorative Plasterwork is sort of like the huge Bible of traditional plasterwork. It's not cheap to buy a copy, but £100 should find you one, and everything is in there you'd ever need to learn. Contact people like us and come and spend time on site with us. We probably engage with 20 to 30 different plasterers a year, offering, experience in various aspects of things we do. And I'm sure other companies will probably do the same.
Yeah.
In terms of new books, there's a new book by me that came out last year about early British plasterwork. And it's the first ever how-to guide to early British plasterwork. So it's shameless book plugging, I'm afraid. But
no, not at all.
The problem with early plasterwork was that nothing was really written down about methods, recipes, and that sort of thing. And so through my own research over the last 30 years, I've basically compiled all of that information on what mixes, what goes into the mixes, how to apply it, how to finish it, how to make everything. And I've put it all in a book, and that's available via my website.
That's super. We will put a link in the show notes to your book as well. Well, it's been an absolute pleasure, Philip. Thank you so much for joining us and sharing your wealth of knowledge and experience. And just before we say goodbye, where can people learn more about you and the work of Gaches Traditional Plasterers?
Okay, well, if you just put our surname into Google or any other search engine, our website will pop up, but also links to articles we've written. Our LinkedIn page has several articles on it that are freely available to everybody, covering various aspects of traditional plasterwork. If you visit our website, there's lots of information on there, but also lots of images of work we've been carrying out at various stages. So it's quite self-explanatory through the portfolio pages. There is also a page where you can buy our book about early British plasterwork, which is a how-to guide, the first and only ever written, which includes all of the secrets, all of the recipes, all of the methods and techniques that you need to make a new Jacobean or Elizabethan plaster ceiling. And that's us, really, I suppose.
Oh, that's fantastic. So thank you again, and we'll make sure to include all the information in our episode notes. So it's been an absolute pleasure. I've loved talking to you today, and it's been a real insight to your amazing craft. So yeah, just once again, thank you for today.
Well, thank you very much, Vincent. I've enjoyed it too. Getting to know you and something about your work has been fascinating for me too. And I'm always happy spending an afternoon in a comfy chair talking to somebody about plaster. Anyway, thank you very much.
Wonderful. Okay, goodbye for now.
Bye, thanks.